Chapter 1. The Storm That Hunts. She ran. She didn't know how long she had been running. Minutes, maybe hours. But her legs no longer felt like her own. They were borrowed things, stolen from some other girl who still believed in safety, in pack, in home. The forest swallowed her whole, roots clawing at her ankles, branches slashing across her cheeks, as if the very trees wanted to punish her for daring to exist. The storm had come from nowhere. Or maybe it had always been there, lurking just beyond the ridge, waiting for her specifically. The kind of storm that carried teeth. Her name was Lyra Ashvane, and she was bleeding. The wound on her side? A jagged slash from shadow claws she could still barely comprehend. Burned with a cold fire she had no name for. Not quite pain, not quite numbness. Something in between, like a word on the tip of your tongue that refuses to come. She pressed her palm against it as she ran, felt the wet heat of her own blood, and kept moving. Behind her, they howled. Not wolves. Not exactly. The shadow beasts were something older than wolves, something that had been stitched together from the spaces between moonlight, assembled from hunger and ancient grudge. They didn't move like natural creatures. They bled through the dark rather than crossed it, and their howls didn't echo. They absorbed sound, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. Lyra's silver flame flickered. It lived just beneath her sternum, a warmth she had carried since childhood and never understood, while a light that had no business being inside a girl from a mid-tier pack with no bloodline distinction, and a mother who refused to speak of her father. The flame had always been small, contained, manageable. A strange quirk she had learned to smother in public, the way other girls learn to keep their voices low. But now, with the shadow beasts closing in, it was anything but manageable. It surged without warning, flooded her ribs, and she gasped. Not from pain, but from the sheer enormity of it, like trying to hold an ocean in a glass. Her skin lit from the inside for half a second, silver and violent and terrifyingly beautiful, and the nearest shadow beast shrieked and recoiled. She didn't stop to wonder why. She ran harder. The rain came down in sheets. It found every gap in her torn clothing, every cut on her skin, and turned the forest floor to mud that pulled at her boots like a living thing. Thunder cracked overhead, not the rolling, distant kind, but the immediate, personal kind that shook the ground beneath her feet and made her feel very small and very alone. She had been alone for 3 weeks. 3 weeks since the mating ceremony. 3 weeks since she had stood in front of every person she had ever known, dressed in ceremonial white, trembling with hope and terror in equal measure, and watched the man she had been paired with step back, look at her with something between pity and revulsion, and speak the words no one ever expected to say out loud. Rejected, unmated, unworthy. The word exile had followed so quickly after that, it barely registered as a separate wound. It was all one long fall, and she was still falling. If you have ever stood in front of people you trusted and felt the floor disappear beneath you, stay with her. She fell so you could understand what it means to keep moving anyway. She crested a ridge she didn't remember climbing and looked down into a black valley, the rain making it impossible to see more than 30 feet in any direction. Behind her, the shadow beasts were regrouping. She could feel them the way you feel a storm before it arrives, in the pressure of the air, in the particular silence that precedes devastation. She had nowhere left to run. The silver flame roared, and then, From the dark below her, something moved, not toward her, but in front of her, between her and the valley's edge. A shape, a silhouette, massive, still, watching. On 2:01 to 5:00, the unexpected savior, the Alpha appears. Chapter 2, The King in the Dark. He stepped into the thin gray light between two strikes of lightning, and the rain didn't touch him the way it touched everything else. It fell around him rather than on him, as if the storm itself had decided he warranted a different relationship with the weather. He was enormous, not in the exaggerated, cartoonish way of the men who performed strength, but in the way of something that had simply grown to fill the space it was meant to occupy. His shoulders blocked the wind. His presence had weight to it, a gravitational pull she felt in her sternum, worryingly close to where her silver flame lived. He looked at her the way people looked at fires, alert, careful, fascinated against their better judgment. "Lyra Ashvane," he said, not a question. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had never needed to raise itself to be heard, because rooms naturally arranged themselves around it. It moved through the rain like it belonged there. She stumbled to a halt. Her hand was still pressed to her wound. Her heart was slamming against her ribs with the particular urgency of a body that hadn't decided yet whether this was rescue or new danger. "You know my name." Also not a question, but for different reasons. "I've known your name for longer than you've been running." He didn't move toward her. That registered, somewhere beneath the fear. The deliberate distance he maintained. The way he held himself like a man who understood that proximity was a power he could choose not to use. "The shadow beasts won't cross my territory line. You're safe for the moment." She looked around her. The howling had stopped. The dark had pulled back, just slightly, like something cowed. "Who are you?" she asked. "Kaelin Dreveth." A pause, weighted with something she couldn't name. "Alpha King of the Northern Conclave." She had heard that name. Of course she had heard that name. Every pack in the known territories had heard that name, whispered it with either reverence or dread, sometimes both. The Alpha King who had taken the Northern Conclave from 4 warring factions and made it into one. The Alpha King who was said to be centuries old, though he looked. She forced herself to assess him with the detached clarity of a woman who had nothing left to lose. He looked perhaps 40. Sharp jaw, eyes the color of dark amber, lit from within by something she couldn't identify. A scar along his left cheekbone that someone had earned in a very interesting and probably fatal way. Old, the rumors said. Powerful, unmarked by time in ways that weren't entirely natural. Widowed once, perhaps twice, and alone now by preference rather than loss. A man who had stopped wanting things centuries ago and was all the more dangerous for it. She squared her shoulders. The wound in her side was fire. Her silver flame was a barely contained storm. "I don't need a king's rescue," she said. "And for the record, I don't date older men." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile. Too controlled for that, too aware of its own power. But something. "You've never encountered one like me," he said, and his voice carried the rumble of thunder in it, low and certain and utterly without arrogance, which somehow made it worse. She wanted to say something cutting. Something that would establish very clearly the terms of her independence and her complete indifference to men who looked at her like that. Like they were reading a book they had been searching for across a very long lifetime. Instead, her legs gave out. He moved then, fast, faster than something that large should be able to move, and caught her before she hit the ground. His arms were warm despite the rain. She hated that she noticed. 5:01 to 10:00. Inner Torment and Backstory. Chapter 3. The Wound Beneath the Wound. She woke in warmth. This was suspicious enough on its own. Warmth had not been a feature of the past 3 weeks, which had been defined primarily by cold forest floors, the charity of strangers, and the particular emotional temperature of someone who has been publicly discarded and is still not entirely sure what to do with that information. The room was stone and firelight. Not extravagant, but solid. The kind of solid that suggested the person who built it intended for it to last and had made peace with permanence in a way she hadn't. A narrow bed. A window showing rain. A fire that burned without any fuel she could identify. She was no longer bleeding, which required some accounting for. Her shirt had been replaced with something simpler. She noted, with relief, that she was still fully dressed, just cleaner. And the wound at her side had been bound with something that smelled like forest and mountain herbs, and something else. Something older, almost electric. She lay still for a moment and did what she had trained herself not to do. She remembered. The ceremony had been held at the central lodge, which the pack used for every significant occasion. Births, matings, deaths. It smelled like pine resin and old wood, and the accumulated weight of everyone who had ever stood in it and meant something. She had arrived early, because she always arrived early. She had smoothed her dress 17 times. She had told herself that the nerves were normal, that everyone felt this way, that the fact that she had never quite fit anywhere was simply the product of circumstance and not evidence of some fundamental flaw she couldn't name or fix. Marcus had walked in with the easy confidence of a man who had never questioned his belonging. She had watched him take one look at her, not a calculating look, not even a cruel one, just an honest one, and watched his face do the thing faces did when they encountered something they hadn't expected and didn't want. "I'm sorry," he had said, quietly, almost gently. "I can't." The silver flame had surged then for the first time in years, and she had suppressed it so hard her vision had gone white at the edges. Because that was the other thing. That was the thing no one knew, and she had never told anyone, had been warned since childhood never to speak of. The flame. The thing in her chest that didn't belong to normal girls from ordinary packs. Her mother had called it a gift when Lyra was small. By the time she was 12, she had stopped calling it anything at all. The silence had been its own kind of answer. "It's the bloodline," said a voice from the doorway. She sat up sharply. Kaelin stood at the threshold of the room. Not inside it, she noted, but precisely on the line between in and out, as if he was waiting for permission or granting her the choice to refuse his presence. He held a cup of something steaming. "You were listening." "I was nearby. There's a difference." He crossed to the small table beside the bed and set the cup down without approaching her further. "The silver flame is a trait of the Ashvane bloodline. The original line, not the branch that settled into ordinary pack life 3 generations back. The original." She stared at him. "My mother never—" "Your mother was protecting you." He said it without judgment. "There's a prophecy. There has been for a very long time. I'll tell you the parts that matter when you're ready to hear them. For now, drink. The wound needed more than herbs." She looked at the cup. She looked at him. "Is it safe?" she asked. Something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptible, but there. "I don't offer things that aren't." She picked up the cup. 1001 to 1800. The Myth Awakens, Prophecy and Destiny. Chapter 4. What the Stones Remember. He took her to the sacred grove at dawn. She hadn't agreed to go exactly. She had simply found herself walking beside him through the wet morning forest, wrapped in a borrowed cloak that smelled like cedar and old iron, following a man who moved through the trees as if they rearranged themselves around him rather than the other way around. She was beginning to understand that a great many things rearranged themselves around Kaelin Draveth, and that this was probably dangerous information to have. The grove was a clearing 3 kilometers into the mountain's heart, ringed by standing stones so old the carvings on them had blurred into suggestions rather than images. At the center, a single flat rock that had been worn smooth by, she didn't want to think by what. Time, maybe, or significance. She stepped into the clearing. The stones lit up. Not dramatically, not all at once, not with a thunderclap and a choir. They simply began to glow, very softly, the carvings suddenly legible in silver light. And the light was the exact shade and temperature of the flame in her chest. She stopped walking. The silver in her own skin responded, rose to meet it like 2 halves of a frequency finding each other after a long separation. "What is this?" she whispered. "The oldest record of your bloodline." Kaelin stood at the clearing's edge, the hands clasped behind his back, watching with the focused calm of a man who had spent a very long time waiting for something and was keeping his reaction to its arrival very carefully contained. The stones were placed before the packs formed their current hierarchies, before the alpha title meant what it means now. She moved toward the nearest stone. The carvings resolved into images as she approached. A woman with fire in her hands, wolves gathered at her feet. A circle of figures, some welcoming, some afraid. A single flame rising higher than the rest. "The Marked One," she read, or rather felt. The words didn't exist in any language she knew, but they arrived in her understanding anyway, as if they had always been there waiting. Will fracture corrupted blood. Will end what tyranny built. The prophecy has been reinterpreted approximately 12 times in the past 5 centuries, Kaelin said, and she heard the dry precision in his voice that suggested he had lived through at least half of those reinterpretations. Each generation manages to read it as referring to themselves or to their enemies, depending on which is more convenient. "What do you think it means?" A pause. "I think it means exactly what it says." She turned to look at him. "And you brought me here because you think I'm this marked one." "I brought you here," he said carefully, "because the stones lit up when I carried you through the grove last night. You were unconscious. I thought you should see it for yourself." She turned back to the stone. But the woman with fire in her hands had her face, or close enough to it that her skin went cold. Not exact, not a portrait, but the particular set of the brow, the line of the jaw. "I don't want to be significant," she said, and the honesty of it surprised her, how plainly it came out. "I don't want to be a prophecy or a bloodline or a marked anything. I want to be ordinary. I wanted to be ordinary." "I know." He said it with a gentleness that had no performance in it, nothing to gain. "The things we're built for rarely ask our permission first." She looked at the flame rising from the stone carving. She looked at her own hands, where the silver light was pooling in her palms like warm water. "What did it do?" she asked. "Before. The flame. To the tyrant alphas. It exposed them." He crossed into the clearing then, slowly, giving her room. Corrupted power has a frequency. The flame reads it, forces it into the open where it can't hide behind ceremony and hierarchy. He stopped a respectful distance away. It doesn't destroy, it reveals. What people do with the revelation, that's their choice. She thought about Marcus stepping back from her. She thought about the exile, the vote, the pack elder's face. Carefully neutral in the way of someone who had already made a decision and was merely following procedure. What if I use it wrong? She asked quietly. Then I'll tell you, Kaelin said, and we'll correct course. A beat. You're not alone in this, Lyra. You never were. The stones glowed steadier. Overhead, through the canopy, she could see a patch of blue sky cracking open through the gray. 1801 to 2600. The first clash. The world fights back. Chapter 5. The coalition arrives. They came at midday while the sacred grove's light was still warm on her skin. 7 wolves in human form, flanked by 2 she didn't recognize, and 1 she did. Alpha Revek of the eastern shores, broad and cold-eyed, with the practiced authority of a man who had been the largest person in every room for so long, he had forgotten it wasn't a natural law. He looked at Lyra the way one looks at an infestation. Draveth. His voice carried over the clearing without effort. I see you've acquired a stray. I see you've trespassed into my territory without invitation. Kaelin's voice was perfectly, dangerously even. That's a discourtesy I generally don't extend twice. Revek smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. The conclave is concerned. There are reports of silver flame activity in your northern forests. You understand what that means, what the historical precedent is. A flame bearer without proper containment is a political liability for every pack within 100 miles. She is a guest under my protection, Kaelin said, and she requires no containment. The girl is unaffiliated, unpacked, and in possession of an ability that destabilizes the hierarchy simply by existing. The conclave's position? The conclave has no position on guests in my personal territory. A pause that had iron in it. Update your charter. Lyra had been very quiet during this exchange, cataloging it the way she cataloged everything, watching the power structures underneath the words, the way Revek's men deferred to him without looking at him, the way Kaelin's absolute stillness communicated something that his words didn't need to. She had grown up in a mid-tier pack. She understood the grammar of hierarchy. She also understood that she was the problem they were trying to solve. 3 days later, after Revek's delegation had withdrawn with the particular dignity of people who are not retreating, but rather repositioning, the shadow beasts came again. This time to a village. She heard the screaming before she smelled the smoke. She was already running before Kaelin reached her. When they arrived at the edge of the settlement, the destruction was precise. Careful, almost. The kind of destruction that knew exactly how much to do to make a point without crossing into the kind of carnage that would demand military response. Someone was directing them. Someone with enough intelligence to understand the optics. And someone had left her cloak at the scene, specifically her cloak, the borrowed one from Kaelin's sanctuary, which she had left hanging by his door, and which had no business being in the ash of a burned-out storefront 7 kilometers away. Evidence, planted with the particular cynicism of someone who had done this before. She stood in the ruins of the village square and felt the eyes of the survivors on her. Felt the familiar weight of being looked at as a problem rather than a person. Her silver flame rose in her chest, not aggressively, but defensively, the way a body makes itself warm against cold. They're going to say I did this, she said. Yes, Kaelin said beside her. His voice was quiet. If I stay near you, it gives the coalition grounds to move against the conclave, against you. A beat. Also, yes, She closed her eyes. She thought about the stones glowing, about the prophecy, about the particular cruelty of being built for something that required you to break other things first. I have to go, she said. Lyra. Not because I'm afraid. She opened her eyes and looked at him, this impossible, ancient, steady man who looked at her like she was the thing he'd been reading about for a very long time. Because if I stay, they'll use it against you, and you're the only one who hasn't looked at me like I'm a problem to be managed. She walked away from him into the gray afternoon. She told herself it was the right choice. She told herself this with great conviction, all the way to the forest's edge, where she stopped and stood very still and didn't cry, mostly. 26:01 to 35:00. Deepening connection. Trust me or leave. Chapter 6. Firelight and Old Wounds. He found her on the third night. She had made camp in a shallow cave halfway up the mountain's eastern face. Not a great camp, but functional. She had a fire going, which she was fairly certain she wasn't supposed to have given, that she was theoretically in exile from her exile. The silver flame had helped with the kindling. She was trying not to read too much into this. She heard him before she saw him. Not his footsteps, which were essentially silent, but the change in air pressure that seemed to accompany his arrival, as if the atmosphere made accommodations. You followed me, she said, without turning around. I followed the silver light, he said. It's quite visible from a distance when you're not suppressing it. She had stopped suppressing it, she realized. She wasn't sure when. He sat down across the fire from her without being invited and without making it an imposition. She had noticed this about him, the way he occupied space as though he had assessed it for everyone present and determined where he would be least intrusive. Centuries of practice, maybe, or simply an unusual quality of attention. You didn't have to come, she said. No, he agreed. The fire moved between them. She looked at it instead of him. Why are you alone? She asked after a while. An alpha king. You could have. People must have wanted to be near you. People want things from power. You could have had that kind of company for centuries. A long pause. She thought he wasn't going to answer. I had it, he said finally. For a while. Another pause. My mate died in the 3rd century of the Conclave's formation, a sickness that moved faster than any cure we had. I ruled for her, built what we'd talked about building together. But the ruling without someone who was there for the reasons that had nothing to do with power. He stopped. She looked up from the fire. I became careful, he said. I became very careful about who I let matter. And now you're sitting in a cave with a technically exiled, presumably wanted, actually chaotic silver flame person, she said. I am. That seems very uncareful. Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one, the shadow of one. And she thought that the difference between someone who smiled easily and someone who smiled rarely was that the rare ones meant it down to the bone. It does, he said, and didn't look away. The fire leaned between them. She felt the silver flame in her chest, doing something she didn't have a name for. Not surging, not threatening, just present, warmer than usual, aware. I'm afraid, she said quietly. Not of him. He seemed to understand this. I know. Not of the flame, or not only. I'm afraid of what happens when I trust something, and it... She stopped, started again. I was so certain, at that ceremony. I was so certain it was going to be fine. I had convinced myself so completely. She shook her head. Being wrong about trust that completely makes you question everything you think you know about reading people. That's a reasonable response to that specific kind of pain, he said carefully. It's also one of the ways hurt can protect itself, by making the evidence of its own conclusion so overwhelming that nothing new can get through. She looked at him. I see you, Lyra. He said it quietly, but with a directness that left no room for deflection. Every part of you. The flame, the exile, the ceremony, the fear, and the part of you that ran toward a burning village instead of away from it. I see all of it. The fire cracked between them. She felt the space between them as something with weight and texture, something that could be crossed or not crossed, and the choice was entirely hers. And he would wait with that infinite, unhurried patience while she made it. She didn't cross it. Not yet. But she leaned fractionally forward, and so did he, and the almost was its own kind of arrival. 35 minutes and 1 second to 45 minutes. The grand betrayal, the mask drops. Chapter 7. The circle. They meant to break her. The council summoned them a week later. The letter arrived with all the correct seals and appropriate language. A reconciliation ritual, it said. An opportunity for resolution. A formal clearing of the accusations against the flame-bearer under the auspices of the full Elder Council, with Kaelin as witness and guarantor. She looked at the letter for a long time. I don't trust this, she said. Neither do I. Kaelin set it down on the table. But refusing it gives them grounds to act without procedure. If we attend, we control at least the timing. And if it's a trap, then we find out what kind. He looked at her steadily. I'll be there. I won't let... You can't promise that, she said, not accusingly, just accurately. They'll restrain you politically if they need to. That's how they work, isn't it? Procedure as a weapon. He was quiet for a moment. Yes? Then we go in knowing that. She picked up the letter. I'd rather face the thing directly than let it come for me in the dark. The ritual chamber was deep beneath the council's fortress. Old stone, old carvings, a circular floor with inlaid silver that she recognized now as a binding pattern. She knew what it was the moment she stepped over the threshold and felt her silver flame contract. Elder Moran stood at the chamber's center, robed and ancient and radiating the particular smugness of someone who has planned for every contingency and is now arriving at the moment he has been patient for. The prophecy speaks of the flame as a tool, he said, before she had fully entered. Before anyone had spoken a greeting. It can be extracted, separated from the bearer, stored safely, where it can be studied without the risk of unpredictability. She felt Kaelin go still beside her. That's not a reconciliation, he said, very quietly. It's a practical solution, Moran said. The girl is untrained and unstable. The flame in controlled hands. Whose hands, specifically? The council's, as it should be, as it was, before the bloodline scattered. Moran looked at Lyra with something that might have been clinical if it hadn't also been hungry. She'll be comfortable. She'll be provided for. The flame is simply too significant to remain in private possession. The binding circle activated. She felt it snap around her ankles, invisible, pulling her silver flame downward toward the inlaid pattern in the floor. 2 council guards moved to flank Kaelin. Not to attack him, but to interpose, to keep him in the procedural space where the rules he'd built couldn't be broken without breaking himself. She watched him understand this. She watched him calculate the options. She watched the conflict of a man who had lived by certain principles long enough that abandoning them would require becoming someone else. She would not let him become someone else for her. The binding pulled harder. She felt her flame begin to move toward the pattern, toward the stones, felt the particular violation of something being taken from inside yourself. And then it didn't go. Instead, it turned. She didn't direct it. She didn't decide anything. But the silver flame, faced with the binding circle designed to extract it, did something entirely unpredicted. It merged. It folded itself inward, wound itself through her like thread through a needle, and became something she couldn't see and the binding couldn't locate. She became very still. "What is she doing?" one of the guards said. "I don't—" Moran's certainty cracked just slightly. "She should be—" Lyra looked up. Her eyes were silver. She walked out of the binding circle as if it weren't there. Because for her now, it wasn't. She was the flame. There was nothing to extract. She reached Kalen in 3 steps, took his hand, which was warm and large and immediate, and looked back at Moran with something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Certainty. "The prophecy doesn't say the flame can be owned," she said. "It says it fractures corrupted blood. I wonder what yours looks like under the light." Moran took a step back. She didn't pursue him. She walked out of the chamber with Kalen's hand in hers and didn't run, because she was done running. 45 minutes and 1 second to 55 minutes. The power claimed, "I am not your sacrifice." Chapter 8, The Fire. She finally earned the shadow beasts came for the pack village 3 days later. 30 of them, at least, more than she had ever heard of moving together, more than the reports suggested was possible. They came at dusk from the east, and the screaming started before the warning bells. She was 2 hills away when she heard it. She had been told, clearly and by multiple people, that the village was outside her concern, that her exile from her own pack precluded any obligation, that the wisest thing a person in her position could do was to find a place that wasn't anyone's political battleground and simply survive in it. She turned toward the screaming. Behind her, she heard Kalen's footsteps. Not catching up with her, not overtaking her, but matching her pace, running beside her rather than in front. "You don't have to—" she started. "I know," he said. "I'm here anyway." The village was chaos when they arrived. Families barricaded in stone buildings, pack warriors overwhelmed at the perimeter, shadow beasts moving with that terrible non-animal precision, targeting and retreating and targeting again. Someone directing them. Someone who had decided that a demonstration was needed. Lyra stopped at the village's edge. She breathed. She had spent her entire life making herself smaller, quieter, more contained. She had swallowed the silver flame every time it rose because rising felt like transgression, felt like asking for exactly the kind of attention that had, eventually, gotten her exiled. She had learned to perform ordinary because ordinary was safe. But she was not ordinary. She had never been ordinary. And right now, there were children hiding in buildings and warriors being driven back, and something needed to happen that she was the only person here who could do. She stopped making herself smaller. The silver flame rose. Not like before. Not the panicked, unstable surge of a woman running through a storm. Not the contracted, defensive warmth of a woman learning to trust again. This was intentional. This was chosen. She called it up from her sternum the way you call water from a well. Deliberately, with knowledge of what she was drawing and why. And let it move. It spread from her feet first, silver light running along the ground like water finding its level. And where it touched the shadow beasts, it didn't burn them. It read them. It found the frequency of the false thing, the directed, weaponized thing, and broadcast it loudly, clearly, unmistakably, so that every person present could feel exactly what these creatures were and who was controlling them and from where. The village went very still. The shadow beasts went still, too. Directionless, suddenly cut loose from their puppet strings. Then the ground shook. Not the silver flame. Something else. Something underground. Something that had been sleeping for a very long time in the stones beneath this mountain, and had just been woken up by the first genuine expression of the old bloodline it had been waiting for. Lyra felt it rise through her feet, up through her bones, ancient and enormous and not threatening, just there, just finally awake. The shadow beasts broke apart, not destroyed. She hadn't destroyed them, didn't want to destroy things that were themselves victims of direction, but dissolved, released, scattered into the dark they'd come from. At the village's edge, a single figure retreated. Elder Moran, moving fast, alone, his certainty stripped away, and something that looked very much like fear in its place. He looked back at her once. She let him go. He would face accounting eventually, and on her terms, not in a binding circle in the dark. She stood in the village square, in the silence that followed, silver light fading from the ground around her feet, breathing hard, aware of every bruise and old wound, and the particular exhaustion of having finally, for the first time, spent herself fully rather than half. Kalen stood beside her, close enough that his arm brushed hers. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The village elder, an old woman who looked like she had survived things that would have broken other people and had arrived at a general policy of dealing with whatever came next, approached them. She looked at Lyra for a long time. "You could have run," she said. "I know," Lyra said. The old woman nodded once, as if this was the answer she had needed, and turned back to her people. 55 minutes and 1 second to 57 minutes. Emotional cliffhanger and reflection. Chapter 9. What fear costs us. They walked out of the village as stars were coming through. The mountain ahead of them was dark and vast and real, and the path through it was not entirely clear, and Lyra found, for the first time in a very long time, that she didn't mind. "What happens now?" she asked, not anxiously, just as a genuine question, addressed to the night as much as to him. "Now, the political accounting begins," Kalen said. "Moran will face the conclave. The coalition that backed him will have to make decisions about which side of this they want to be on. It will take time. It will be—" He paused. "It will be very boring. A great deal of meetings." She laughed. She hadn't expected to, and it came out real. "You've been doing this for centuries," she said. "Doesn't it exhaust you?" "Yes," he said simply, "but some things are worth the exhaustion." She thought about the people who had turned away from her, and the people who had planted evidence, and the man who had stepped back at a ceremony, and all the ways the world had told her she was too much, too bright, too strange, too flame-touched for the ordinary life she kept trying to fit herself into. She thought about what it had cost her to believe them. There is a question worth sitting with if you find yourself here with her at the end of this night. How often do we mistake fear of someone's power for evidence of their unworthiness? How many people have we stepped back from not because they were dangerous, but because we didn't know how to hold the size of them? She didn't have an answer. She suspected the answer was different for every person who had ever stood in a clearing with silver light pooling in their palms. But she thought the asking was important. If you've ever been the person someone stepped back from, if you've ever made yourself smaller to fit the room, or swallowed the flame because you were afraid of what it would cost you to let it rise, stay with her. She is still learning too. The difference is, she stopped practicing alone. The mountain rose ahead of them. The stars settled into their old patterns. The ancient underground something, whatever had woken in the stones, rumbled quietly, contentedly, in the dark. 57 minutes and 1 second to 1 minute, 0 seconds. Ending, tease. This isn't over. Chapter 10. The other flames. They sat on the mountain's eastern face, above the tree line, where the wind came clean off the peaks, and the valley below was a dark map of forests and rivers and the scattered lights of small communities going about their ordinary lives. She sat close enough to him that their shoulders touched. He had stopped maintaining careful distances somewhere between the binding circle and the village square, and she had stopped pretending she didn't notice. "Tell me about her," Lyra said. "Your mate." A pause. "She was brave," he said. "She was always braver than she needed to be." She used to say that courage wasn't the absence of good judgment. It was the decision that some things mattered more than safety. Another pause. "She would have liked you." "You don't have to." "I know I don't." He looked at her sideways in the starlight. "I want to." She leaned, very slightly, into his shoulder. He didn't move away. They sat like that for a while, not saying anything, because nothing needed saying, because some things are complete without language, and this was one of them. The mountain breathed around them. The flame in her chest was warm and steady and hers. Then the ground shook again. Not the same as before, not the ancient sleeping thing waking. This was specific and distant, directional, coming from the south and west simultaneously. 2 separate points, 2 separate rumbles. She sat up straight. "What is that?" Kalen was already on his feet. His eyes had gone distant in the way of someone accessing very old memory, cross-referencing it against present sensation. She had learned to read his silences in the past weeks, and this one had something unfamiliar in it. Something that might have been, on anyone else, the beginnings of alarm. "The prophecy," he said. "I told you there were parts I hadn't shared yet." She stood. "Tell me now." He looked at her in the starlight. Something had shifted in his expression. The careful containment was still there, but underneath it, something else. Something that had been held back not out of deception, but out of not knowing how to say it, how to begin. "The flame doesn't skip a bloodline," he said. "It scatters. When the original line split, 3 generations back, it didn't diminish. It distributed." She understood before he finished. She felt it, actually, in the same sense she had felt the stones in the grove respond to her. A resonance, low and unmistakable, coming from the south and from the west, from 2 points in the dark that were each distinct and individual and unmistakably the same frequency as the light in her chest. "How many?" she asked. "At least 2 others," he said. "Possibly more. I've been watching for the signs for a long time. The attacks on you weren't just political, Lyra. Moran was trying to prevent them from finding each other." She stood on the mountain's face with the wind in her hair and the stars above, and the silver flame burning steady and certain in her chest, and felt the distant echoes of her own fire coming from people she had never met, and already, somehow, knew. "Then we find them," she said. "Yes," Kalen said, simply, like a man who has been waiting for exactly this sentence. Below, in the valley, the ordinary lights continued their ordinary arrangements. The mountain kept its ancient patience. The wind moved south, and somewhere in the dark, two other flames burned quietly, not yet knowing they were being looked for, not yet knowing that everything was about to change. The story isn't over. It's just beginning to understand its own shape.